Good morning, Carl. Thanks very much, and thanks indeed for inviting me back onto your virtual stage. So as Carl said, my name is Tim Hill from GlobalData. I'm going to be talking about the Asia-Pacific market size for dairy by products and country, as well as looking at some of the intergenerational differences and focusing on the priority countries. So what I'll do now is I'll go to share screen. And just expand that up. Okay, great. So first of all, I'm going to look at the market size of Asia Pacific compared with the overall global market. And as you can see from this slide here, the global dairy and soy food sector was valued at 519,000 million in 2019 and is expected to grow at a compound annual growth rate. Our growth period is 2019 to 2024. Of 3.7%. The Asia Pacific component for dairy and soy food is the largest in the world in 2019, valued at 175,000, expected to reach 242,000 in 2024, which is a CAGR of 6.6%. So in volume terms, the sector is expected to grow from 78,000 million kilograms to 99,000 kilograms, registering a CAGR of 4.8%. The per capita consumption was 19.4 kilograms, which is actually the smallest, as you can see, globally, similar to the per capita expenditure, 43.3%. But of course, Asia makes up for it because it's got the largest populations in the world. Okay, so now we're going to have a quick look at what this means by year-on-year growth. Looking at the graph here, it shows the annual year-on-year value and volume growth analysis of the dairy sector in Asia Pacific compared to other regions in the world over 2019 to 2024. And the overall dairy and soy sector in Asia Pacific was forecast to record the highest growth, as we've seen, at 6.6% in value terms, and in volume terms, the CAGR is 4.8%. Looking at this in a bit more detail now, this graph here on the left shows the volume growth, CAGR on the left, and on the right, what we've done is a mapping of the countries by value size and CAGR, and this is based on the regional average to identify the high potential countries, which you can see in the top right green square there of China, India, and Japan. By category, the graph here, the bubble size shows the growth potential of all the nine, it shows all the nine categories in the APAC dairy sector during the growth period. And you could look at it by bubble size, you can see the milk category accounts for the largest value share, which is 43%. And this is followed by drinkable yogurt in the blue circle there, and then top right, the yogurt categories, and they hold respectively 27% and 13% value shares. The yogurt category is expected to have the fastest CAGR, and that's the X category along the bottom. So you can see the yogurt category out there of 10%, followed by milk having fastest CAGR, value CAGR at 7%, and followed by drinkable yogurts. And in volume terms, and this is the vertical axis here, the yogurt category is forecast to register the fastest volume CAGR at 7%, and that's followed by milk at 6%. Before getting into the country comparisons, what I'd like to do now is to have a look at some of the intergenerational differences that we're seeing across Asia Pacific with dairy consumption. This comes from our regular consumer surveys. So I've picked out a few areas of interest for this. First of all, one of the main trends that we're seeing when we compare Asia Pacific, and Asia Pacific in this graph here is in light green, against our respondents from the rest of the world, is that there seems to be a much higher concern about health and safety in the region compared with the rest of the world. So when we ask the reason, what are or what would be your reasons for consuming plant-based alternatives to meat or dairy products, then the Asia Pacific respondents much more likely than the rest of the world to indicate that health and safety were at the back of their minds. And when we looked at this by generation, what we see is the Gen Zs, the Gen Ys, and to extent the Gen Xs, really being much more concerned than the older generations about health in light green, and then safety in dark green. And notice actually that taste is one of their next big concerns. But big differences between the younger generations and the older generations here in concerns about health and safety. And what this means is how it impacts their purchasing habits in a couple of different ways. So when we ask, how would you describe your spend on white milk? What we see is, if we look at the dark green sides here, is that the Gen Y, the millennial generation, and then the Gen X and the Gen Z are much more likely than the older generations to indicate that they buy high-end or premium versions of these products, compared with, you see, the boomers and the silent generation on the top, much less likely. And this is just asking about the spend on white milk. They're buying high end. But what we also see is millennials in particular, and then the Gen Z, also indicating not only are they likely to buy high end or premium versions, but they're also much more likely to buy large portions and buy this more frequently. And another indication of how this impacts their spend is when it comes to what type of products are they purchasing for dairy. And if we look at the dark green indicators here, what we notice is that, again, the younger generations, particularly the Gen Y, the millennials, then followed by the Gen X and the Gen Z, are saying they are much more likely to buy products made by foreign or global multinational brands, whereas we see the older generation not quite so keen on this necessarily. What we do see from the older generations, though, and we're looking at the black lines here, is that they're quite happy, certainly in comparison with the younger generations, with products made by private labels. So that could be supermarkets' own brands. So the younger generations are interested in premium, they're interested in buying more quantities, and they're interested particularly in products from foreign or global multinational brands. What I want to do now is to turn to the GlobalData scoring system to look at the countries in the region, priority countries in the region. And we have put together the scoring system that looks at the opportunity, and I'll show the figures for this shortly, but 4 main countries that we've identified in the region, which we think have got the highest growth opportunities, are Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. So let's have a look at the numbers for these and why we've selected these. And what we've got here is we've got the value. So we've got the 2014 values compared with the 2019 values, and then our forecast for 2024 values. So we can see the compound annual growth rates. And then in green, we've got how that's translates in terms of the actual volume consumption for the different milk products there. So just give you an indication as to why we decided these are the priority markets. Now, the next few slides indicate the country level contribution to all the different categories that we're mapping. So what we've got on the top slide is in the gray bar here, this is the dollar value for butter and spreadable fats category as at 2019. And we move along to the green bar here, and that's our forecast for what butter and spreadable fats category is going to look like by 2024 and what the growth is of that. And then what we're showing is which are the priority countries that are going to contribute towards that growth. So for butter and spreadable fats, we can see India is going to be the largest component, single country that's going to be driving that growth. When we look at the cheese category in the graph underneath that, again, we see on the left 9,784 in millions, moving to 13,000 millions by 2024. And the biggest country contributing towards that is going to be Japan, followed then by China. How does it map out for the other products? Let's have a look. So for the cream category, we see the biggest drivers of this are Japan, followed by the Philippines on the top graph. And then on the graph below that, when it comes to dairy-based and soy-based desserts category, what we see is Japan being the biggest driver, followed then by China. And then moving on to the drinkable yogurts category, far and away the biggest driver of that growth is going to be China, massive consumption by China, extra consumption by China during this forecast period, followed then by Japan. And curiously enough, actually, when it comes to, on the graph below, the fromage frais and quark category, what we see is Azerbaijan being the biggest driver of that growth. Milk, which is the biggest, one of the biggest overall components of the dairy sector, as you'd expect. The drivers for this country driver is India, particularly, followed then by China. But when it comes to the growth of soy milk and soy drinks category, which is particularly prevalent where I live in Singapore, we can see China driving that growth, followed by Japan. And finally, for the yogurt category, you see a massive proportional consumption increase from China over the forecast period, followed by Japan. So on a summary then for our priority markets for all the categories, what this is showing is that cheese, drinkable yogurt and yogurt are going to remain high, or going to have good consumption in pretty much all the main countries that we are looking at. On a per capita basis, we said earlier that milk is at the bottom here. We can see that milk, when we look at it by volume, pretty much all the priority countries, as well as the rest of Asia Pacific, are forecast to have big consumptions of milk on a volume basis compared with the other product categories. And the next slide, looking at it on a value basis, again, we see very big contributions from all the countries, including rest of APAC, for milk, which is the backbone of the industry. When we look at the country by country contributions, then let's have a look at the priority markets now for Japan. And what we see is on the top right, the donuts graph there on the top right, is we see that milk is the biggest component of their consumption, followed by yogurt and followed by cheese. As we'd expect on the bottom left, the leading companies that are going to be contributing towards this are all Japanese, famous Japanese companies like Meiji, Yakult, for instance, that are driving this growth. And then we can see obviously the market size and growth figures on the left and the packaging on the bottom right. When we look at this in a bit more detail, when it comes to consumption by age group, what we've got is quite interesting on the top right. Well, actually, just look at the top left. First of all, we look at the donut chart. What we notice is that females are more likely to consume this than males in Japan. But on the top right, when it comes to consumption by age group, we see a huge contribution, 37.7% for the older consumers, the over 55s, that really are the driving force behind this market, which obviously has implications that we'll be talking about in the future. Some of the trends that are happening in Japan. So what we've noticed is that the younger population are very experimental in nature, and they're willing to experiment with new and unusual flavors when it comes to food products. So the industry is reacting to this. So Danone Biobotanicals branded yogurts recently been introduced in a jasmine orange flavor and an Earl Grey flavor varieties. And these are claimed to offer the natural tea leaf taste along with scents of citrus and flowers, which should be, to my mind, quite an interesting yogurt, I suppose. What we're also seeing is demand for lactose-free milk. It's been growing due to the increasing incidence of lactose intolerance in Japan. So Calpis company, for instance, has launched its fermented soy milk drink under the Asahi Green Calpis banner. And the product is claimed to be plant-borne and it's made by fermenting soy without using milk ingredients and is also free from cholesterol. Let's have a look now at Singapore. Interesting enough, and I did mention this earlier, is that for Singapore, soy milk and soy drinks is the biggest component of the dairy and soy market at 30%, followed then by milk and followed then by drinkable yogurts. When we look at the companies driving this, we see some Malaysia influence, quite a bit of Malaysia influence, as Singapore relies on Malaysia dairy farms, as well as Meiji Holdings. When we then look at who's consuming it, we do see on the top left, the donut chart, we do see a slight leaning preference from the females towards milk. When we look on the top right by age group, we do see, similar to Japan, that there is a lot of consumption by the over 55 group. However, it is the older, younger adults. So these are, I suppose, people at the heart of the millennial generation, the 25 to 34-year-olds that are driving milk consumption in Singapore. Some of the key trends, we see a lot of adventurous and experimental consumers. I think this speaks, to the affluence of Singapore, and they seek novel flavors and flavor combinations, similar to, as we saw to Japan, in regular beverage products, such as milk. So for instance, Yeo's branded milk drink has recently been launched in Singapore that claims to offer an uncommon date flavor in milk beverages, which an interesting and novel choice of flavor there. We're also noticing rising obesity levels and concerns over this in Singapore. So consumers are paying close attention to the amount of sugar and fat in the food products that they purchase. So as a result, they often seek specialized drinks that contain low sugar and fat in order to stay fit. So Milo is consumed quite extensively here, particularly amongst school kids, including my own. Nestle Milo's branded chocolate malted milk. They have a version of it that claims to contain 50% less sugar and is also tagged as free from trans fat and high calcium content. Okay, how does this compare with across the border Malaysia? Well, as we saw bottom left, we saw Malaysian companies helping to feed the industry, but we also notice here Friesland Campina and Nestle being up amongst the leading companies providing the sector. But what's interesting, if we look top right, we'll see that milk massively dominates Malaysia's category share for dairy, 75% in the top right donut chart, dwarfing everything else. The next highest one is drinkable yogurt, which is interesting. Why is this? Well, I think the next graph will probably show why this is. When we look at on the top right, the consumption by age group, and we see that kids and babies are really dominating the sector. 35% of consumption is down to kids and babies, and the other components are much smaller in comparison. Some of the trends we're seeing, so Malaysia has got increasingly disposable income levels, so consumers are demanding premium products to treat themselves. So manufacturers are introducing high quality products to meet demand for self-spoiling. So dairy products that have interesting flavors and attractive packaging are good. So for instance, Bajaya Food Trading has started distributing a Starbucks branded premium chocolate drink that's said to be inspired by the brand's signature chocolate drink sold in the food service chains. The new release is described to be made of the signature chocolate powder to create a premium chocolate drink. But we're also noticing introduced fortified dairy and soy products being more common to make sure that children are getting the required range of nutrients for their growth and development. So Arla Foods, for instance, has recently launched an Arla branded kids cheese sticks. They're said to be high in protein and calcium to address these concerns. Let's have a quick look now at Vietnam, which was the fourth country in our priority list. The category share for this, very similar to Malaysia, was a massive consumption of milk there. The brands on the bottom left, we see Friesang Campina against, but we also see local brand Vina Milk and also TH Food Chain. And some of the trends, so the food developed especially for children, and you can map this back to the high consumption of milk. They're finding patronage amongst working parents, as these offerings allow busy parents to provide adequate nutrition to their children, even when they're dealing with a hectic lifestyle. So for instance, Lactel Evil branded milk powder for children has been recently been introduced in a growing up variant, claimed to contain the necessary nutrients for growing babies. And we also see a demand for products tailored to specific health requirements, such as those with turmeric. So consumers believe that turmeric has a positive impact on their health. So TH True Nut brand has launched a milk that includes nuts and turmeric to address this. So let's just go to some of the key challenges that we see in the Asia Pacific region. Well, we've talked about shrinking populations. We've seen this in Japan. We understand this is starting to happen in China as well. So that massive driving force that we saw from the older generation for the dairy market in Japan is going to create issues with the sector. We see competition from other sectors, so snackification trends, particularly amongst young working consumers when they finally get back to their offices. They tend to have a preference for sweet and salty snacks, and this is in competition with the dairy sector. And then there is a preference for alternative diets. So health-conscious consumers are experimenting with diets that might reduce the intake of milk products, so that affects the dairy sector. And so my final slide is the future outlook. What do we see is over this period and over this decade, we do see a rise in plant-based dairy alternatives driven by the veganism trends, driven by concerns over health and safety. We also see a demand for high-end, innovative and personalized dairy products, stuff with novel flavor experiences, fortified with nutrients such as vitamins, proteins, fiber, probiotics, and so on. And then also countries which lack adequate infrastructure and cold storage facilities, such as India and China, but there are many others, particularly Indonesia and the Philippines as well. And this is going to drive the demands for extended shelf life products, products such as UHT milk. Okay, so that's our overview of the sector. What I'd like to do now is to hand back to Carl and ask if there are any questions or comments. Thank you.